My name is Hannah Cooper. I'm 36 years old, serving as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. For most of my adult years, my father has acted as if none of that holds any value, all because I chose not to stay and claim his business empire. On the evening of his 68th birthday, I stepped back into the house I'd grown up in, a sprawling estate smothered in chandeliers and dripping with old oil wealth. The moment I crossed the threshold, the same cold ripple ran under my skin that I'd felt the night I left. A jazz trio played something smooth and practiced, the kind of song chosen to feel expensive. Glass against glass chimed through the air. Dallas's elite drifted between small clusters, trading smiles and secrets, while I stood in uniform, an understated challenge in a room that worshipped power the way soldiers worship survival. My plan was simple: sit quietly, offer a few polite handshakes, listen to the speeches, and leave without stirring any trouble for my father's big night. But power has a way of demanding an audience, even if the performance is cruel. Midway through dessert, my brother Mark leaned back in his chair, smirking as he raised his glass toward me like a judge preparing to hand down a sentence. A combat veteran singing? His voice carried just enough for the nearest tables to catch every word. What a joke. Several heads turned, bracelets froze mid-clink over polished wrists. My father, Thomas Cooper, didn't bother to hide his grin. Go on, he said, waving his fork like a conductor. Show them your voice. The laughter that followed was sharp, the kind people use when they're certain their target won't show any cracks. I could have ignored it, like I had every other insult over the last 20 years. But instead I rose. I didn't ask for a microphone. I didn't cue the pianist. I didn't even wait for the room to hush. I walked to the center of the marble floor beneath the chandelier my father had shipped in from Paris, drawing in a measured breath as if I were stepping out of a helicopter into the evening heat. Mark whispered the insult again, not realizing he was etching a memory he'd want erased. My father chuckled, repeating the challenge. I began the first line, no accompaniment, no echo, nowhere to hide. My voice climbed, and the air seemed to cool. Waiters paused mid-step near the doors. The faint ringing of glass became a fragile harmony before vanishing altogether. The chandelier's crystals caught and returned the sound in 1,000 muted sparks. For the first time in that house, it felt like the walls themselves were listening. The men my father admired had learned silence in polished boardrooms. I'd learned mine in valleys where an echo could get you killed. This was that silence, sudden, absolute, disciplined. My second line came steadier, rooted deep in my chest. Breath, diaphragm, control, release. I'd trained my singing the same way I trained my shooting, not to earn applause, but to focus, to keep someone else alive for just one more minute. Halfway through the phrase, I saw my father shift. The scorn left his face, not out of understanding, but because he realized the room's attention no longer belonged to him. I ended the phrase clean, no plea for approval. In the quiet that followed, chairs scraped softly, one in particular. A man in a dark dress uniform, older now but still broad-shouldered, stood from a table near the back. His salute sliced through the chandelier light like a blade. His eyes glistened. The sound of held breath moved through the crowd like a tide. Silence, I thought, is the most honest kind of applause. But what came next was louder than any ovation. He kept the salute until I dipped my head. Then he spoke, his voice rough, like it hadn't been used all night. The words weren't staged, they were a recognition, like he'd been holding onto a photograph for years and finally found the face to match it. Someone whispered, "Who is he?" Another replied quietly, "General Harris." The name spread through the room in murmured ripples. David Harris, retired now, though some ranks follow you past the uniform. My father's face shifted into something I'd never seen, not fear, not shame, but the sharp realization of a plan gone wrong. Mark stopped smirking. He looked at me, then at Harris, then back again, like a man staring at a door he hadn't known existed suddenly opening in a locked room. My mother's fingers crushed her linen napkin into a tight fist, the only slip in decades of flawless manners and floral table settings. Guests shifted uneasily, unsure whether to applaud, stand, or pretend they hadn't heard an old commander's voice naming me like a missing soldier finally found. The hum of the air conditioner grew too loud in the unnatural stillness. Harris walked forward without hesitation, a man well past the age of asking permission. When he reached me, he lowered his hand. 9 years ago, in the canyon east of Al-Qaeda, I heard that voice over a dying radio. 13 men held their ground because that voice told them where to put their fear. You didn't sing for applause. You sang to keep us breathing. I didn't answer right away. I turned to my father. He couldn't meet my eyes. There are defeats you can pretend away in public. This wasn't one of them. Shame isn't loud, it's a slow chill that creeps from your face down your spine until your posture itself becomes an admission. I gave Harris a small nod. General. The word carried 2 decades of weight, all owed to men who'd learned to rise again when standing was the last thing their bodies wanted to do. The room finally exhaled, relieved to have a narrative to applaud. They thought they'd just seen redemption wrapped in a song. They didn't know redemption keeps its own ledger. Some memories don't arrive whole, they show up in jagged pieces, like shrapnel that still shifts beneath the skin. 9 years earlier, the sky was iron gray, and the canyon walls bounced our own gunfire back at us, distorting distance. The radio sputtered, batteries fading, and fear rose in a pitch the human voice isn't meant to reach. I found that pitch deliberately, because panic spreads fastest when it thinks it's alone. I remember a young private, dust darkening his freckles, counting the beats between mortar blasts as if he could make a bargain with time. I told him to breathe in for 4 counts, out for 4, to match my rhythm so his lungs had something to do besides collapse under terror. I remember the stench of scorched metal, and the half-spoken name I never finished. Not every voice gets to finish. When Harris said my voice held the line, I thought of the men who did the same with their bodies while mine held it with air. I thought of the boy who ran left when the map said right, because right was already gone. I thought of the silence in combat, not noble, not poetic, just real. A subtraction that only makes sense later, when you're handed a casualty list and a pen. My father's guests would never smell that canyon or understand the geometry of fear, or how a voice can mark a perimeter around it just long enough to reload discipline. I let the memory pass, not to shield them from it, but because I knew I was holding onto something that would only reveal its meaning in time. The same voice that once kept soldiers alive could also condemn a man who had never touched desert soil. Inside me, the tempo slowed, adrenaline sinking back into a steady rhythm. The image of the general's salute still hovered in my mind, but another vision began to push through, one of a signature, an authorization code, and a corporate name I wasn't yet ready to admit belonged to my own bloodline. That night, I expected things to end with polite applause and perhaps a private apology for my father, though I knew it would never be spoken aloud. I thought the guests would return to their tinkling glasses and rehearsed conversations, the way wealthy rooms do when emotions threaten to interrupt their comfort. I was wrong. That first note hadn't closed an old wound. It had opened a case file. A week later, in a quiet office that belonged to neither of us, General Harris slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside were procurement logs, shipment records, and a contract number circled in thick red ink. The supplier was a subsidiary. The parent company was headquartered in a gleaming tower downtown, its logo identical to the bronze plaque on the gates of my family's estate. Cooper Defense. My father's signature wasn't on the first page. Men like him don't hand their names to paper casually. It was buried deep, on an authorization letter, the tidy scroll of his handwriting approving a supply chain he'd never bothered to follow to its end. Later, he'd claim ignorance. But men who profit from distance rarely don't know by accident, they avoid knowing because awareness would demand they refuse the money. I shut the folder. The first note I sang at his party had been a reckoning. I didn't realize until my fingers touched that paper that it had also been a key. A key that turned inside a lock my family had built, and one I was finally ready to open. I am Hannah Cooper, Lieutenant Colonel, combat veteran, singer when circumstance demanded it, daughter by blood, witness by choice. And that night, as the applause faded, I understood that I was also the person who would bring my father onto the only stage he couldn't control, a courtroom, where silence means something entirely different. I grew up in Dallas, inside a mansion that looked flawless from the street but felt hollow once you stepped inside. My father, Thomas Cooper, was the sort of man who could still a room with nothing but his eyes. He built his empire on defense contracts, real estate, and a cultivated image of untouchability. My mother was gentler, but she rarely raised her voice in that house. Mark, my older brother, had been groomed since birth to inherit the Cooper name and everything attached to it. From the time we could walk, it was clear who was the heir and who was merely the stubborn shadow. As a child, I found my refuge in an old piano that sat neglected in the corner of the formal living room. Covered in dust, it was more decoration than instrument. I remember pressing a single key for the first time, the trembling sound feeling like my own breath finally taking shape. That note became my secret language, a way to say all the things I was forbidden to speak. While Mark earned praise for learning the stock market at 13, I was told to sit still and look pretty in family portraits. My father never understood music, and never cared to. One afternoon, when I was 11, I gathered the courage to play for him. I remember the melody, simple, fragile, barely rising above the sound of his phone conversation. When I finished, he didn't clap. He didn't even lift his eyes. Without a flicker of emotion, he said, "You'll never be a pianist." It wasn't just dismissive, it was final, like a verdict. The words stuck, not because I believed them, but because they revealed exactly who he was. That night, when the house was asleep, I pressed a key again. The note lingered in the dark, quiet air, soft but unbroken. I promised myself I would find my own stage, one where I didn't need his approval. I didn't know then that this path would take me far from the Cooper estate and into the heart of deserts where my voice would be used for reasons my father could never comprehend. Leaving the mansion wasn't dramatic. No screaming, no slamming doors. I slipped out quietly, almost unnoticed, because staying would have smothered me. I didn't enlist to prove my father wrong. I joined the army because I needed a place where worth wasn't tied to money or family name. I craved structure. Something raw and unpolished, something that would strip me down and teach me to stand on my own. Basic training was unforgiving. The first weeks felt like one failure after another. I was slower than I wanted to be, weaker than I believed I was, and every morning I wondered if I had made a huge mistake. But each blister, every bruised knee, every barked order from a drill sergeant chipped away at the doubt I'd been carrying since childhood. Pain didn't destroy me, it carved me into something sharper. One night, after an especially punishing field exercise, I collapsed onto my bunk too drained to cry. A fellow recruit handed me a canteen and said, "Cooper, you've got the grit of 10 people. Use it." That was when I first understood that the stubbornness my father despised was actually a weapon. The army left me with scars, some I could see and some I couldn't. I failed tests. I repeated drills. I lived through days when quitting seemed easier than breathing. But I stayed, not for medals or recognition, but because the work gave me a quiet sense of purpose. It taught me that strength isn't about winning, it's about holding steady when chaos closes in. And somewhere in those dust-choked training grounds, I uncovered a voice I hadn't known was mine. The same voice that would one day still an entire room of strangers. 9 years ago, I learned that fear has a sound. It isn't a scream or a shout, it's the uneven breathing of soldiers desperate to stay alive while the world detonates around them. We were trapped in a narrow canyon east of Al-Qaeda, the air thick with grit and gunpowder. Every shot bounced off the stone, twisting direction until you couldn't tell where the next one would land. Our radios were failing, the batteries near dead, each transmission cracking like brittle leaves underfoot. Panic began to slip in, not loud but lethal. I scanned the faces of the men around me. Most were barely past 20. Some still carried the unscarred look of youth, but their eyes had gone wide and vacant. Sergeant Miller leaned toward me and whispered, "We need something to hold this line." I didn't think, I just opened my mouth and sang. It wasn't a rehearsed piece, just a melody that had once been my hiding place at the piano. The first note startled them, then steadied them. I matched the beat of the song to our breathing, inhale on 4, exhale on 4, until the panic thinned. The gunfire didn't stop, but it stopped owning us. That fragile rhythm became our shield, enough to keep us together until reinforcements arrived. Later I learned that part of my voice had been caught on the radio, a low, wavering tune drifting through static. That recording somehow made its way through our unit, becoming a strange kind of anthem. It wasn't because the singing was beautiful, it wasn't. It was because, in that moment, the voice had given everyone something to grip when everything else was breaking apart. It was during that mission that I first met Colonel David Harris. He was already a man of unshakable endurance, the kind of leader who could command an entire space without uttering a word. After the canyon was secure, he came up to me and said, "Cooper, whatever you did out there, it saved lives. Don't lose that voice." I nodded, but I didn't yet understand the weight of what he meant. Only years later, when he rose to salute me in my father's ballroom, did I realize he'd carried that melody with him, the same note that kept us breathing when the world tried to choke the air from our lungs. The day I pinned on the silver oak leaf of a lieutenant colonel should have been one of the proudest of my life. I had survived that canyon, led missions that pushed me beyond every limit, and earned a rank few ever reach. The ceremony was understated but heavy with meaning, rows of soldiers standing sharp, the national anthem cutting clean through the air, my commanding officer fastening the insignia to my uniform. It was carved from years of sweat, discipline, and grit. I sent a message to my family, not expecting much, but hoping for something. Maybe a quick call, maybe a small note of pride. Hours later, a text from my mother came through, "We're proud of you. Dad's tied up in a meeting." My father didn't even write me directly, his assistant forwarded 2 dry lines, "Congratulations, Hannah. Good for you." I knew that tone. It was the same voice he used signing contracts, detached, perfunctory. That night, I stood alone in my quarters, staring at the polished silver leaf on my chest. I wasn't angry, not really, I just felt empty. I finally understood that no matter how high I climbed, he would never see me as more than the girl who'd left the estate to play soldier. That was the moment I stopped waiting for his approval. My worth was measured in the soldiers who trusted me with their lives, not in a father too busy guarding his empire to notice who I had become. 3 weeks after that promotion, a thick cream envelope showed up in my base mailbox, its wax seal pressed with a Cooper crest, as if legacy could be mailed. Inside was an invitation to my father's 68th birthday gala. Black tie. RSVP required. The kind of thing Dallas society calendars call culture. I read it twice, not for the words, but to check my pulse. It stayed steady. That told me more than the invitation itself. I didn't need his approval, and I certainly wasn't foolish enough to think I'd find it between champagne toasts and polite smirks. But I did have unfinished business, with the house that taught me silence and the man who mistook it for obedience. Going back wasn't about mending fences. It was about taking a measure. I wanted to see if the woman who had walked out years ago would still shrink in those marble holes, or if rank scars and the canyon had shaped me into someone who wouldn't bend to family politics. I packed a single dress uniform and running shoes. No gowns, no diamonds, nothing that hinted I was returning to play a role written for me before I could spell my name. Mark texted, "See you soon, hero," punctuating it with a laughing emoji. That told me exactly how the night would start. My mother called, offering a car from the airport. I told her I'd drive myself. Independence isn't a speech, it's a chain of small refusals. As the plane descended over Dallas's neat grid, I looked down and thought about first notes, how sometimes the only way to know your voice has changed is to use it in the same room that once tried to drown it. That night, the Cooper mansion glittered with its usual arrogance. Chandeliers threw shards of light across the ballroom like fragments of judgment. Men in tailored suits and women in gowns worth more than a year's soldier's pay filled every corner. I stayed near the back, my dress uniform pressed sharp, my medals a quiet declaration most would ignore. Mark saw me first, weaving through the crowd with a glass of scotch and a smirk rehearsed long before tonight. "Well, if it isn't the family soldier," he said, his voice dripping with the same mocking tone he'd worn since we were kids. "People here have been talking about you, the war stories, the singing." He let the last word hang, deliberate and condescending. A combat veteran singing. What a joke. I felt the shift as nearby guests turned to watch, their curiosity sharpening. Mark wasn't finished. Raising his glass like a gavel, he added, "Go on, Hannah. Show them your voice. Give us some entertainment before the real speeches." My father, Thomas, leaned back in his chair at the head table, observing with the faint smirk of someone who enjoys the spectacle. He didn't stop Mark. Instead, he gestured toward the center of the room with his fork, like presenting an exhibit. "Yes, Hannah," he said evenly, but with that commanding undertone. "Why don't you show us what all that military training has done for your talents?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, polished, practiced cruelty. I looked at Mark, then at my father. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I set down my glass, smoothed the front of my uniform, and said, "Fine." The hush that followed wasn't respect, it was hunger. They wanted a spectacle. I was ready to give them something they'd remember, though not for the reasons they imagined. I stepped forward, not for them and not for my father, but for myself. Because sometimes the loudest defiance is to stand exactly where they expect you to fall. Eyes followed me, some amused, waiting for me to falter, others bored, just craving distraction. But one gaze caught me and held me, sharp, steady, unmistakably recognizing me. It was Colonel David Harris. Seated near the back, dressed in a dark suit that did nothing to disguise the posture of a man who had spent decades earning respect. His hair had silvered, but his eyes were still clear as glass. When our eyes met, time folded in on itself. For a moment, I wasn't in my father's ballroom. I was back in that canyon, dust clawing at my throat, my voice threading through the static of a dying radio. Harris's expression tightened, just slightly, brow lowering, lips pressing into a firm line. I saw the memory flicker there, and I knew without any doubt he recognized me, not as the daughter of Thomas Cooper, but as the voice that cut through gunfire nearly a decade ago. He tilted his head, a subtle signal urging me to do exactly what I'd come here to do. Mark was still laughing to someone beside him, but his voice was far away now. My father leaned back, certain this would make me small again. Harris leaned forward, hands resting on his knees, his gaze never wavering. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a quiet understanding. I filled my lungs with a slow, deliberate breath. In that moment, I understood this night wasn't about proving myself to the Cooper family. It was about remembering who I had become, a woman who had stared fear in the face and walked away breathing. I gave Harris the slightest nod. His jaw tightened, and I knew he understood. He'd heard my voice before, and tonight, he was about to hear it again. I stood beneath the chandelier, its crystal prisms scattering light across the polished marble like fragments of a spotlight. My father leaned back in his chair, waiting for a stumble, maybe a nervous laugh, anything that would confirm his belief that I didn't belong in this manicured world of men and their carefully rehearsed dominance. Instead, I shut my eyes, inhaled deeply, and let out the first note. It wasn't dramatic or showy, it was steady, bare, and unflinching, cutting clean through the low hum of whispers and the faint clink of crystal. For a beat, the room didn't know what to do with it. I could feel my father's gaze pressing on me, waiting for the laughter to follow. But none came. That note carried weight because it wasn't entertainment, it was the canyon's echo, the same tone that once kept 13 soldiers locked to the line while death closed in. The air shifted, subtle but undeniable. The guest who'd been smirking seconds earlier straightened in their chair. A waiter froze mid-step and lowered a tray without sound. I opened my eyes long enough to see my father's jaw tighten. He glanced around, searching for someone to share a smirk with, but was met only with stillness. Even Mark, who had been laughing moments ago, stood motionless, his mouth slightly open like he wasn't sure if the joke had turned on him. The silence had changed, it wasn't polite anymore. It was respect. The melody moved forward, stripped of accompaniment. I wasn't there to win their approval. I was there to remind myself that my voice could stand alone, even in a room that had once worked to make me invisible. As the last note faded, I dropped my hands to my sides, calm and steady. No one clapped, at least not right away. They were caught off guard, unsure of the right response. My father shifted, jaw tight. I knew he wanted to seize the room back, but for the first time, it wasn't his to take. That moment belonged to me. It was the first visible crack in the wall he'd built around the Cooper name. I glanced toward the back and saw Harris on his feet, his expression grave, as though listening to a voice he thought he'd never hear again. That was when I realized silence could be louder than applause. And in that silence, my father looked unsure of himself for the first time in my life, and that alone felt like a win. The applause that followed was awkward, scattered, and died quickly into a hush. A few forced laughs, a change of subject. I excused myself from the ballroom. I needed air, something that didn't reek of perfume and pride. The garden was lit by soft lanterns hanging from the ancient oaks, the air warm and heavy. I stood beside the stone fountain, letting the trickle of water center me. Then I heard footsteps, measured, deliberate. Harris emerged from the shadows, his presence carrying the same gravity as it had inside, but here, away from the audience, his eyes softened. "You haven't changed much," he said, stopping just a few feet away. "Except your voice. It's stronger." I gave a faint smile. "You remembered?" "I could never forget that canyon," he said, his tone low. "Your singing kept us breathing. But that's not why I needed to talk to you tonight." He reached inside his coat and pulled out a slim leather folder. "What's this?" I asked, my voice tightening. "Evidence," he said. "I've been chasing this for years. And I believe your family's company, Cooper Defense, sent an untracked shipment of weapons that ended up in enemy hands during that operation." The air between us seemed to thicken. "I didn't want to believe it," he went on, "but the documents don't lie." My breath caught. I took the folder, its weight cold and toxic in my hands. Inside were contracts, shipping manifests, and internal memos all stamped with Cooper Defense's seal. My father's empire. You're saying my father? I stopped, unable to finish. Harris nodded. He may not have known every detail, but his signature approved these shipments. Those weapons were used against our men, against us. I gripped the folder tighter. My pulse quickened, and the canyon came rushing back, the soldiers I'd sung to, the desperate minutes we'd stolen from death. And now my family's name was tethered to that fight in the worst way imaginable. Why tell me now? I asked quietly. Because I saw you stand up to him in there, Harris said, his gaze locked on mine. I need someone inside. Someone who understands both the price of silence and the weight of truth. The fountain's steady trickle was a counterpoint to the storm building in my chest. I didn't know what to say, but I knew this was no longer about a family's reputation. It was about justice. I left the garden with the folder under my arm, my hands cold despite the sticky Texas night. Harris's words followed me like distant gunfire, soft at first, then impossible to ignore. I told myself it couldn't be true. My father was ruthless, yes, but not reckless enough to arm the same men who'd nearly killed me and my unit. Yet doubt had already taken root. And doubt demands proof. Instead of returning to my hotel, I drove to a quiet cafe that stayed open past midnight. I ordered a black coffee and spread the folder open under the dim yellow light. Inside were copies of shipping records, each marked with Cooper Defense's emblem. I traced the ink with my fingers as if the paper itself could answer me. The dates matched the operation. The destinations were cloaked in coded abbreviations, but I recognized the region. I pulled out my laptop and logged into public defense procurement databases, searching the contract numbers Harris had marked. They were there, buried among legitimate deals. A few more clicks and I found myself staring at internal memos, leaked years ago and forgotten by the press. One line stood out like a bullet hole, approved for expedited delivery. Initial DC, David Cooper. I froze, hoping the initials belonged to someone else. But the deeper I dug, the worse it got. Scanned authorizations bore my father's full signature. Notes in his assistant's handwriting confirmed his approval. He could claim ignorance, but the paper trail whispered otherwise. My hands shook, not with rage, but with the suffocating weight of realization. This wasn't negligence. It was complicity. And if Harris was right, those weapons had been in the hands of the men who ambushed us, the same men I'd sung over, trying to keep a handful of lives from slipping away. I don't want to believe this, I whispered, my voice barely cutting through the low hum of the cafe. But I didn't have the right to turn away from the truth anymore. It felt like the ground under my life had shifted. I pictured my father at the head of that long dining table, surrounded by people who had never tasted real fear, never learned what survival actually cost. And yet, his name sat on documents tied to betrayal and death. That thought hardened something inside me. I shut my laptop, gathered the papers, and slid them back into the leather folder. My reflection in the cafe window stared back, decorated, disciplined, but carrying a weight no rank had ever prepared me for. I knew I had to keep digging. If this was real, it needed to see daylight, no matter the cost to me or my family. The next morning, I found myself driving toward the Cooper corporate tower downtown. I hadn't planned it, my hands just steered me there, as if my mind had already made the decision. Inside, the lobby gleamed under cold light. On the wall hung a photo of Mark, polished and smiling among the company's executives. The golden child. The one who stayed. The one who knew how to play the game. He found me in the hallway near the elevators. "Hannah," he said, sharper than usual. "Dad's not here. What are you doing?" "I'm not here for Dad," I replied, holding the folder Harris had given me. "I need to ask you about these." His smile flickered, just for a second. Something crossed his face, fear, guilt, maybe both. He didn't take the papers, just glanced at them. "Where'd you get those?" "From someone who believes Cooper Defense has blood on its hands." "Were you involved?" Mark's jaw tightened. "Don't start with that tone. You have no idea how this business works." He stepped closer, voice lower. "I've been cleaning up Dad's messes for years, signatures, authorizations, paperwork that could never be traced back. I thought I was protecting the company. Protecting us. So you knew." My voice was steady, but something cracked inside. I knew enough, he admitted. Enough to realize saying no would destroy everything. I didn't like it, Hannah. I'm not cold-blooded like him. I just don't know how to fight him like you do. His honesty caught me off guard. For the first time, I saw him not as the smug brother who'd mocked me my whole life, but as someone who'd been living under the same shadow, too comfortable with silence to break it. And silence, I realized, can destroy as much as action. Then maybe it's time someone finally fights him, I said. He looked away. He didn't answer. Sometimes memory is like a stack of photographs left in the rain. The edges blur, the colors run, and you start questioning if you remember the truth or just the story you've told yourself. For years, I believed the canyon was simple. I sang, I held the line, and I kept my people alive until help came. That's what others told me. That's what I told myself. But fragments have been surfacing, ones I've avoided because they don't fit that clean version. Between the second verse I hummed and the mortar fire, I remember civilians pressed against the canyon wall. I shouted for someone to cover them. Then the next moments blur. Did I run to them? Did I lead them out? My memory insists I did, but doubt says otherwise. I remember a young soldier, barely 20, named Evan Cole. Reckless in a way people mistake for courage. I can still see him charging toward those civilians while bullets ripped through the air like steel rain. He waved us forward, yelled for us to move, then nothing. Just smoke, debris, and the ringing in my ears. We told his mother he died a hero. Maybe he did. But what if his death wasn't just the cost of war? Harris's folder hinted at something darker. If those untracked weapons really came from Cooper Defense, then the same bullets that killed Evan might have been signed off by my father. I can't fully believe it yet. But deep down I know, maybe that day wasn't my story to tell at all. Maybe it was his, and I've been holding it because seeing it clearly hurts too much. The more I dug, the heavier the evidence became. Every page pointed in the same direction. My father's company had been part of a supply chain that cost American lives. I met Harris again the next night at a quiet diner outside Dallas. He was already there, a manila envelope sitting on the table like a live round. "We can't treat this like some family dispute," he said as I slid into the booth. "This isn't about grudges. It's about accountability. If we move it quietly through the right channels, the DoD and FBI can trace every link." I nodded. "I don't care how careful we have to be. I'm not letting this disappear into another boardroom cover-up. We do it by the book." Harris leaned forward, voice low. "You know what that means? Your family's name will be dragged through the mud. Your father will face federal charges. And your brother, he won't walk away clean." I stared at my reflection in the window. "I understand. I'm not going to shout it across the mansion. I don't need to. The truth will speak for itself once it's in the right hands." That night, we scanned every page of his files and my research onto a secure drive. Harris made the first calls to people he trusted in federal investigations. I wrote a formal report, attaching every document stamped with the Cooper Defense seal. When I hit send, a strange stillness settled over me. This wasn't anger anymore. It was resolve. The vertical spike. The moment you push your own blood into the fire, not just for revenge, but because silence would make you part of it. The news broke early Tuesday morning. I woke to my phone vibrating nonstop, calls, texts, headlines flashing across the screen. Cooper Defense under federal investigation for illegal arms supply. By the time I turned on the TV, it was the lead story on CNN and CNBC. Reporters swarmed outside the company's headquarters. Helicopters circled the downtown tower with my father's name in bronze. The empire's polished image shattered overnight. Shares of Cooper Defense collapsed within hours, bleeding millions from its market value. Contractors and partners issued formal suspensions. I could almost hear the panic ricocheting through every corridor of the empire my father built. My mother called first, her voice shaking. "Hannah, what's going on? They're saying awful things about your father. The phones won't stop ringing." I kept my tone even. "Mom, the truth is coming out. It has to." There was a long pause before she whispered, "Did you start this?" I didn't answer. The silence was answer enough. That afternoon, Mark called. His voice was sharp, urgent. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The board's in chaos." Dad's losing it, Mark said over the phone, his voice quick and uneven. He's calling lawyers, leaning on old favors. He says this will destroy us. I thought of Evan Cole. I thought of the civilians pressed against that canyon wall. I thought of the soldiers who never made it home. Maybe it's time something destroyed the illusion, I said. By nightfall, the story had gone global. Every network was running the same loop of words: corruption, negligence, blood money. I sat alone in my apartment, the TV screen flickering against the walls, knowing this was just the opening round. I'd lit the fuse, and now the blast was rattling every foundation under the Cooper name. I found my father in his office that night. The air smelled faintly of whiskey, the kind he kept for important deals, or bad news. The leather chairs, the heavy wood shelves, the muted lighting, it all felt smaller than I remembered. He sat behind his desk, shoulders set, eyes burning with the kind of pride that refuses to admit defeat. My phone buzzed with missed calls from Mark as I stepped inside, a folder of printed contracts in my hand. He didn't look up right away. Here to gloat. His voice was even, but tight. No, I said, setting the folder on his desk. I'm here to show you what you signed. He hesitated before flipping through the pages. His face stayed still, but his jaw tightened. I pointed to the line where his signature sat in bold ink. These weren't just numbers on a ledger, Dad. They were weapons that ended up in enemy hands. Do you understand what that means? He shut the folder and leaned back. I don't know the details of every deal, Hannah. I can't track every shipment. That's not how a company this size operates. Not knowing is a choice, I said, keeping my voice calm. You built this empire by keeping your hands clean on paper, while others did the work you didn't want to see. You can't claim ignorance when the blood is on your signature. His gaze locked with mine, his expression darkening. You've always had that self-righteous streak. I built all this for this family, for you, and now you're tearing it down. I stepped closer. You always thought I was weak, that I'd crumble without your approval. But you're the one who can't stand on his own truth. You think power means hiding your mistakes. It doesn't. It means facing them. Something flickered in his eyes, fear maybe, or the realization that I'd stepped completely outside his world of silence and control. His palm hit the desk, but when he spoke, his voice shook. You don't understand the weight of these decisions. I understand more than you think, I replied. I've carried men dying on my watch. I've seen what happens when weapons fall into the wrong hands. And now I know some of those weapons carried your name. That's a weight you can't drink away. His face hardened, but he said nothing. The silence between us was heavier than any argument. For the first time, I didn't see him as the untouchable head of the Cooper family. I saw a man cornered by his own choices. The next night, I found Mark in the study. He was pacing, his tie loose, sleeves rolled, a half-empty glass of bourbon in his hand. The smug, needling brother I knew was gone. What stood in his place was someone frayed at the edges, trapped between loyalty and shame. You think you've won, Hannah? He said, my name catching in his throat. The FBI is circling. The board is falling apart. Do you realize what you've done to this family? I shut the door behind me. What I've done didn't start with me. It started with Dad's deals, and maybe with you. How much did you know? He turned toward the wall of family portraits, his back stiff. I knew enough, he muttered. Enough to know the contracts weren't clean. I saw the paperwork, the shipping codes. I buried some of it. Made files disappear before they could raise flags. The confession still hit like a punch, even though I'd suspected it. Why? I asked, my voice sharp but steady. Because I thought I was protecting all of us, he snapped, spinning to face me. You don't get it. Dad built an empire. People like us don't survive scandal. I did it to keep the name intact, to keep you out of it. I stepped closer. Keep me out of it? Mark, you buried evidence that could have saved lives. Do you know what those weapons did? Who they killed? He shook his head, his voice breaking. I didn't want to know. I told myself it was just business. That someone else would take the hit if it went bad. He swallowed hard. Hannah, I'm not like Dad. I never wanted to be ruthless. I just didn't know how to say no. For a moment, I saw the boy he'd once been, the one who craved our father's approval but didn't know how to fight for himself. His eyes were wet when he asked, "Can you forgive me?" I held his gaze, the weight between us too heavy for quick absolution. "The law comes first," I said at last. "We'll talk after." He flinched but nodded, as if he already knew that was the only answer I could give. For years, I let people tell the story like I was the hero of that canyon, the soldier who sang to hold the line. I didn't correct them. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Yes, I sang. Yes, I kept our breathing steady. But I wasn't the one who saved those civilians pinned near the canyon wall. That was Evan Cole. Evan was barely 20, the youngest in our unit, with sandy hair curling just under his helmet. He had that kind of smile that made you believe nothing bad could touch him. When the first mortar hit, he didn't flinch. When we saw civilians trapped in the open, he didn't hesitate. While I sang to keep the unit calm, Evan ran straight into the fire, sprinting toward them while bullets cracked through the dust. I remember shouting his name, my voice breaking mid-note. He turned once, gave me a quick, certain nod, and then disappeared into the chaos. By the time I finished the song, by the time reinforcements reached us, Evan was lying in the sand, his body curled like he'd simply gone to sleep. The worst part came later, when we found fragments of the weapon that killed him. I barely noticed the serial numbers back then. Harris did. He traced them quietly for years. Now I know they belonged to a shipment authorized by Cooper Defense, by my father's company, by the same man who had mocked my voice at his birthday table, never realizing that voice had been raised to drown out the sound of weapons he'd profited from. I've carried that guilt for nearly a decade. Every medal, every salute, every word of praise felt like a borrowed honor, because Evan never got the chance to stand here and receive it. He was the one who took the real risk, who saved those civilians. All I did was sing. My voice may have held the line, but Evan's sacrifice was the reason anyone survived that day. This truth was the sharpest cut, not just into me, but straight through the illusion of the Cooper name. We weren't just negligent. We were complicit in deals that put death into the hands of children, into the grip of the men who fired the round that ended Evan's life. Years ago, I stood in Evan's mother's kitchen and told her he was a hero. I never told her my family's weapons might have been the reason she had to bury him. Now, with Harris's files in my hands, I knew I couldn't keep that secret any longer. The Cooper legacy, the gleaming towers, the polished plaques, the tailored suits, was hollow. One hard truth, one solid push, and it would all crumble. Tonight, I decided I would be the one to push. Not for revenge. For Evan. For the truth. The storm didn't stop at the courthouse doors. It ripped across headlines, talk shows, and social feeds, feeding on every detail of my family's scandal. Half the country called me a hero, praising my courage to stand against my own blood, to drag hidden corruption into the light. They called me the soldier who fought her last battle with truth instead of bullets. The other half called me a traitor, flooding comment sections with venom. If my kid did this to me, I'd disown them, one post read. A headline blared, Hannah Cooper, savior or snake. Talk shows turned me into an endless debate. One anchor said, she's a whistleblower, a patriot. Another shot back, or maybe she's cashing in her military image to destroy her father. Opinion columns called me both brave and shameless, often in the same paragraph. It was strange to watch strangers turn my life into a public argument. But applause or hate didn't matter. What mattered was Evan Cole's name, the civilians who lived because he gave his life, and the soldiers who deserved to know who had armed their enemies. Outside the courthouse, a reporter shouted, "Hannah, how do you feel about betraying your own family?" I stopped just long enough to answer, there are worse betrayals than telling the truth. The cameras flashed like gunfire, and for a moment I felt like I was back in that canyon. Except this time, I wasn't hiding. I was standing in the open, ready for whatever came. The first day of the hearing felt like two worlds colliding. My father sat in the defendant's chair, perfectly dressed, his tie knotted with the same precision he'd used to build his empire. Across the aisle, General David Harris wore a uniform lined with decades of service. When Harris took the stand, the room shifted. His voice was calm, but every word hit like a strike. He spoke of the ambush, of the weapons traced back to Cooper Defense, of the soldiers and civilians who never came home. My father's jaw tightened. I saw the first crack, not from fear of prison or losing his fortune, but because Harris's testimony was a mirror, showing the cost of his choices in lives instead of dollars. When Harris held up a photograph of Evan Cole, my father looked away. The room was silent except for Harris's voice. "Your company's name is on these weapons. And that name is etched into the graves of the men who trusted this country to protect them." When it was my father's turn, he didn't shout or deny. His voice was low. "I didn't know. I didn't want to know." That was the moment I knew fear had finally reached him, not fear of the law, but fear of the truth. One night, Mark called, his voice unsteady. "I can't keep pretending. There's something you need to see." The next morning, we met in a small conference room at a law office I trusted. He carried a box of files, his hand shaking as he set it on the table. "These are internal memos and shipping logs," he said. "Dad told me to destroy them months ago. I didn't." I opened the box. More contracts. More evidence tying Cooper Defense to illegal arms sales. "Why now?" I asked. His eyes were raw. "Because I can't live like this anymore. I told myself I was protecting the family, but I can't sit here watching it tear apart everything, and say nothing. If handing these over shortens the fight, I'll do it. I'll take whatever comes." For the first time in years, I saw a glimpse of the brother I'd once admired, the one who had defended me when no one else would. He was pale, scared, but resolute. "Will this fix anything?" he asked. I closed the box slowly. "It's a start." His throat worked before he spoke again. "Can you forgive me?" I didn't answer right away. The silence sat heavy between us. "The law first," I said at last. "We'll talk after." He nodded. He understood that forgiveness had to be earned. The verdict came on a quiet Friday afternoon. My father stood in court, no longer the towering figure who ruled boardrooms, but a man stripped down to bare truth. He pleaded guilty to negligent arms trading and corporate fraud. It wasn't a dramatic confession, just a few steady words that closed the book on an empire built in shadows. The sentence brought heavy fines, government oversight, and the forfeiture of major assets. But what stayed with me wasn't the punishment. It was what he said after. "I will not let the Cooper name stand only for profit and shame. I am allocating a large portion of my personal wealth to create the Evan Cole Foundation, to support the families of fallen soldiers and to fund music therapy programs for veterans carrying wounds no one can see." When he said Evan's name, something shifted in the room. It wasn't redemption, you don't earn that in a single gesture, but it was the first honest act I'd seen from him in decades. The press called it a PR move. Maybe it was. But I saw it differently. It was him, finally facing the cost of his choices, even if he'd arrived late to the truth. As we left the courthouse, my mother squeezed my hand. "You did this," she whispered. I shook my head. "No, Mom. He chose this, finally." For the first time in years, the Cooper name carried a weight that wasn't just shame. It carried responsibility. 2 weeks later, I got a call from General Harris. His voice had the same steady tone that once held a line of terrified soldiers together. "Hannah," he said, "I have an offer. The National Military Music Academy wants to expand its music therapy program for veterans with PTSD. They want you to lead it." "I recommended you as an honorary advisor," Harris said. I was quiet for a moment, unsure how to respond. "Me? I'm not a professional musician, General." He gave a low chuckle. "You don't need to be. That voice of yours, that first note, did what no training ever could. You reminded us that music isn't about perfection. It's about connection. About healing." His words landed deeper than I expected. I thought of the canyon, of the way a simple melody had kept fear from swallowing us whole. I thought of Evan Cole, whose courage still rang through every note I sang. I accepted his invitation. When I stepped into the academy for the first time, I didn't feel like the soldier still fighting to prove herself. I felt like someone carrying a torch lit by others before me. Harris shook my hand and said, "Your first note saved lives. Now it will save even more." That was the day I understood something new. Music no longer needed to be my weapon of defiance. It could be my bridge to healing, for myself and for those who carried scars words could never reach. Not long after, I visited my father in his smaller, quieter home, worlds away from the mansion that once symbolized power. He looked older, not just in age, but in the way his shoulders rounded, as if truth had taken the steel out of his spine. He greeted me with a nod, no performance left in him. We sat in the study, the same room where he had once told me, "You'll never be a pianist." Now his voice was softer. "Hannah," he began, "I was wrong about strength. I thought it was about control, money, the ability to command a room. But I see now, it's about facing what you've tried to bury. It's about truth." I didn't interrupt. For years I had wanted to hear some version of those words. But hearing them now, I realized I didn't need them anymore. His hands trembled slightly. "I can't ask you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. But I want you to know, I see you now. I see what you've become." My gaze stayed steady. "Dad, you don't owe me praise. You owe them an apology, Evan Cole's mother, the soldiers who carried the weight of those weapons, the families who paid for our silence." He lowered his head. "I'll spend the rest of my life doing that. The foundation, it's just the start." For a moment, the room was still. But it wasn't the suffocating silence I'd known as a child. It felt lighter, like understanding had finally found a place between us. I stood to leave, but paused at the door. "You once told me I'd never have a voice. But Dad, that first note, my note, did more than you'll ever know. It spoke for those who couldn't." He nodded, eyes wet. He didn't argue. He simply let me go. And maybe that was his truest apology. Silence has a cost. I learned that the hard way. For years I stayed quiet, thinking it was safer to let the world believe what it wanted, about my family and about me. But silence doesn't erase the truth. It just buries it, lets it rot, and makes it heavier with time. A single note, sung honestly, can cut through that weight. My voice was never meant to impress. But the first note I sang at my father's party was the most expensive note of my life. It cost me my family's comfort, the illusion of safety, and a name I once thought I had to protect. In return, it gave me freedom. It gave me purpose. If you're carrying a truth too heavy to bear, I hope you find your own first note, speak it, write it, or whisper it to someone who needs to hear it. My first note once held a line of soldiers together on a battlefield. Now I sing for those who've never had anyone stand and salute them, not with medals, but with respect.